In July 1945, towards the end of the Second World War, just weeks after the defeat of Nazi Germany, a memorial service was held here on Kingsway in London at what was then Holy Trinity Church. The service was for a German Lutheran pastor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had been executed by the Nazi state 3 months earlier. Dietrich Bonhoeffer lived in London from 1933 to 1935, where he led German-speaking congregations in the East End and the southeastern suburbs. After the rise of the National Socialist Party in Germany and the election of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor, Bonhoeffer had resolved, in his words, to go into the wilderness for a spell and simply work as a pastor, as unobtrusively as possible. However, his attention soon turned back to events in Germany, where the regime was seeking to Nazify the Protestant churches. Bonhoeffer spoke out against church leaders who were pro-Nazi. As a pastor, as a writer, as an individual, Bonhoeffer recognized that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary action. However, he also struggled with periods of uncertainty and a feeling of being torn between different choices. Responsible action must decide not simply between right and wrong, good and evil, he said, but between right and right, wrong and wrong. Facing moral dilemmas and making ethical choices was, Bonhoeffer realized, not a question of choosing between black and white, but about wrestling within the grey areas. He recognized that we may not always know what the right action is, but that we should always question what we are doing and why. My name is James Hawkey and I'm Chair of Westminster Abbey Institute and Canon Theologian of Westminster Abbey, where to this day Dietrich Bonhoeffer's statue stands above the great west entrance as one of 10 modern martyrs, heroic Christian witnesses drawn from diverse churches and continents. When his memorial service was held here on Kingsway in 1945, Bonhoeffer was still a marginal figure, unknown to the public. In his lifetime, he travelled from Breslau in Germany to Barcelona, London and New York. After his arrest, he was finally taken to Flossenbürg concentration camp. We invite you to join Westminster Abbey Institute on a pilgrimage across London. We will conclude our journey at the Great West Door of Westminster Abbey. Along the way, we will explore Bonhoeffer's life and reflect on his intention to balance personal ideals and public service with the reality of challenging times. Here in London's Hyde Park, there is a memorial to the 6 million Jews who were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. The words on the stone refer to a passage from the Hebrew Bible from the Book of Lamentations. "For these I weep. Streams of tears flow from my eyes because of the destruction of my people." In 1935, when Bonhoeffer returned to Germany, no one could have predicted the scale of destruction that was to come. But steadily, the Nazi regime implemented increasingly hostile policies and methods of persecution against Jews and other victims of their racial ideology. Bonhoeffer's early opposition to Nazism principally arose from his desire to preserve the sanctity of the Christian Church. He was motivated, he said, by the fact that we are immediately faced with the decision: National Socialist or Christian. Though he sympathised with Jewish victims of discriminatory laws and supported refugees in England, Bonhoeffer returned to Germany not to speak out against anti-Semitism, but to establish and care for an underground Christian seminary. However, reflecting on this period later, when the horrendous scale of persecution had become clearer, he seemed to face up to the realization that he could and should have done more. "We have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. Are we still of any use?" he asked. The world today is not the same world that Bonhoeffer and his contemporaries faced. Have we really learnt the lessons of history? In moral crises, we too reckon with the challenge of how to witness to injustice, when our silence might mean complicity, and how to take responsibility in fast-moving, demanding times. Perhaps Bonhoeffer began to realize that he had not always addressed these challenges strongly enough. Nevertheless, facing up to his own mistakes was the first step in exercising hope in a better future. As his moral struggle deepened during the 1930s, he wrestled more and more with the injustices of his time and the demanding question of what one person could do about them. Following the outbreak of the Second World War, Bonhoeffer took on a more activist role within resistance circles in Nazi Germany. Whilst initially Bonhoeffer resisted the Nazification of the Church, increasingly his opposition to the Nazi state became a more overtly political one. He was eventually arrested and moved from one prison to another. Even from prison, as the news became bleaker and the prospect of his release less certain, Bonhoeffer continued to write to friends, family, and members of his community. He encouraged them to cling on to hope. As he wrote, "Have there ever been people in history who in their time, like us, had so little ground under their feet? People to whom every possible alternative open to them at the time appeared equally unbearable." Walking around Parliament Square, it can be comforting to think that the institutions of public life have come of age in a way which gives them permanence, a seeming ability to withstand anything. But in times of moral crisis, it can feel like the ground under our feet is shaken by unpredictable mounting challenges. In such circumstances, Bonhoeffer wrote in his prison letters, we can find professional targets and personal ambitions, even greater burdens. We can so easily be overwhelmed. But neither should we live consumed by the present without care for the future, nor neglect the present and become lost in imagining an unrealistic future. To follow either course would be to give up under the weight of circumstances. A more helpful and ultimately hopeful response to moral crisis is to live in faith and to act with responsibility, to ask how the coming generation is to live, and to be ready to do what we can to bring about a better reality. Bonhoeffer would not live to see the world this next generation built in the aftermath of the war and the Holocaust. But in the decades since, his prison reflections have continued to inspire people who work for justice and who think about theology and ethics. On the 9th of April 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was executed in Flossenbürg concentration camp. The war in Europe would last just another 4 weeks. When news of his death was confirmed, Bonhoeffer was mourned by family and a close circle of friends, and by leaders in the ecumenical church movement around Europe and the United States. But he was still relatively unknown. That soon changed. First, gradually, with the memorial service held at Holy Trinity, and then as more of his writings were translated into English and published around the world, Bonhoeffer's legacy had an increasing resonance. In 1998, a statue of Bonhoeffer was unveiled here, above the great west door of Westminster Abbey, as one of 10 modern martyrs, Christians who gave their lives for their faith in the 20th century. As the immediate memory of lived experience has faded into history, assumptions and myths have developed around Dietrich Bonhoeffer. To this day, many portray Bonhoeffer as an uncomplicated hero, misunderstanding the nature of his role in a conspiracy which led to the July 1944 attempt on Hitler's life. Some co-opt him to fit their own political causes. But to do so is to simplify Bonhoeffer's story. Like anyone, Bonhoeffer was a person who made mistakes and struggled with questions of frailty and complexity right up to the end. But it is this that makes him such a fascinating figure to remember. His story reminds us neither to seek simple answers when faced with challenging times, nor to think we have nothing new to learn at all. Rather to address the moment as it is, and not to give up. Now that we've arrived at the destination of our pilgrimage, Westminster Abbey, where do we go from here? Bonhoeffer was killed at the age of just 39. His work was left unfinished. But today, a statue of this wise, courageous, but in his own time relatively obscure clergyman looks out on Parliament Square amidst the heart of the UK's public life. It is a salient reminder to anyone who looks up of Bonhoeffer's call that we should do what we can, when we can, and to work so that those things which we cannot accomplish or complete can be picked up by the next generation. It doesn't all fall upon our own shoulders, but we must play our part. Today we remember the wars and persecutions of the past, but we also ask, how can we face the moral dilemmas of continuing conflict and the search for an ethical peace? As Bonhoeffer wrote from his prison cell, we will not need geniuses, cynics, people who have contempt for others, or cunning tacticians, but honest human beings.